Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. First, we'll have a brief chat about the NATO pandemonium that was in town last week. Then we'll turn to the results of the French legislative elections, which produced a gridlocked parliament after Marine Le Pen's National Rally party failed to secure a majority. Then we'll turn to a conversation with Camille, Distinguished Policy Fellow at ECFR, to recap the recent NATO summit in Washington, D.C. We hope you enjoy the show. Okay, Max, I understand you were part of a lot of NATO-related things last week. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, I got to be immersed into the NATO bubble, into the NATO Public Forum, and went to the president's speech on Tuesday night. We'll talk about some of the substance and in the interview I did with Camille. Maybe just a few big takeaways. This was a summit without actually a lot of drama. On the one hand, there was tremendous drama. Washington was consumed by obviously the political conversation about President Biden, whether he would stay in. But substantively, this was not like Vilnius a year before, in which there's a lot of acrimony and discord over Ukraine and Ukraine membership. The White House had really buttoned that down. And then there's a lot of good deliverables in the fairly technocratic sense. You know, these weren't sort of major transformational announcements. And in general, it was, I think, a 75th birthday. Maybe just some other color and takeaway from the week. I mean, it was so hot. It was hot for Washington, and you could just...
You mean the weather, right?
Yeah, the weather. I mean, there was, even at night, people would step outside of the air conditioning and just be shocked at just the kind of, humidity. It felt like the inside of a dog's mouth. And I think when people sort of returned to Brussels or any other European capital that has really crappy weather, I think that a lot of Europeans will be very thankful that, not here in the summer. So the timing of having the summit in July was quite brutal. Everyone was talking about American politics, about President Biden. And I think one thing about that is that a lot of people weren't talking as much about Ukraine and the situation on the ground. And I think in some ways it was sort of a good sign. The front lines have sort of stabilized. This, a few weeks ago, and Jake Sullivan said this in the speech that he gave at NATO, there was fear that this would be a crisis summit with Ukraine really being on the back foot. It in some ways started out that way with Russia attacking children's cancer hospitals, just a completely abominable military strike. But really, this was a summit more about NATO and where NATO is headed in the future, and with the hope that will eventually include Ukraine with a lot of creative diplomatic language. But we'll talk more about the substance in the interview with Camille Grand. But it was a chaotic week when the center of Washington basically shuts down for an entire 5 days. The traffic chaos and nightmare, and then having to walk more places because of the traffic chaos and nightmare. There's a lot of people complaining in Washington, but that's par for the course.
What was the mood like among European leaders alone? Because there's a lot happening at home. So I'm curious if that transpired here.
Well, I think one, interesting part of this is that at President Biden's speech on Tuesday night, there were two leaders missing. You did not have Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or Emmanuel Macron, both of whom had to come, I think, later that night. And so there were some delayed arrivals because of the European elections. Keir Starmer and the UK government did a very good job at making themselves very present and sort of introducing themselves to everybody. We're at a lot of events, especially John Healey, the defense secretary. Macron, I think, came in later, but there was a sense of relief over European politics. And then obviously the concern about where U.S. politics is headed and what a Donald Trump administration would mean for NATO, is sort of an ever-present conversation that's happening in Europe ad nauseum. In fact, if Donald Trump is not the president, we have wasted a lot of time thinking about what will happen if he were to be elected.
Well, probably better to prepare than being caught flat-footed, as Europe was the last time around. Since you mentioned Emmanuel Macron having to arrive a little bit later, why don't we pivot to that a little bit?
Let me ask you, French elections, the outcome in some ways is sort of chaotic, but was a big shock where The National Rally, the far right, finished in third place, even behind Emmanuel Macron's party. And then with the left front, the Popular Front, made up of leftist parties or left and center-left parties, coming in first. So this was hugely shocking, but I'm still seeing Emmanuel Macron being vilified for even calling these elections. But it seems like it sort of worked out. What's your take?
Couple things. On the immediate aftermath, it worked out insofar as it kept the far-right party out of power. That was the plan for a lot of the strategic movements that took place between what we called entre deux tours, so between the two rounds, because the National Rally did really, really well in the first round, and I think that scared a lot of people. So there was immediate agreement to have a lot of candidates in districts where there would have been a three-way race for the second round. A lot of people agreed, who were not obviously National Rally, to take themselves out of the race so that it would be a two-way race and the anti-far-right forces could focus on just one candidate in all of these districts. And it worked wonders. It clearly worked really well. Obviously, the second surprise is how well the left-wing coalition did. I don't think they themselves expected this, but I think that's also because they had fielded a lot of candidates in places that had come in second place. So they were the ones on which a lot of those third-party voters put their votes back on to avoid having to vote for the National Rally. So that worked for them. The other thing that's important to note, though, is that, yes, when you look at the balance of power in the National Assembly now, the New Popular Front comes first, but that itself is a coalition. So within this, it's called in English France Unbowed, or La France Insoumise, which is Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, got 78 seats. For example, the Socialist Party got 69 seats. That's an absolute revival for the Socialist Party, which had completely crumbled in the last few elections. That I'm just saying this to say that itself is a coalition. Same thing for the President's Party. The Ensemble coalition got around 166 seats. Things are still shifting because some deputies are aligning with different parties as things settle into place, but that itself is also a coalition. A big part of it is the President's Party, but there are other parties included in this. Whereas the National Rally got 143 seats, only 17 of those are from right-wing candidates that left Les Républicains to align with the National Rally. So this is just some of the electoral math and how it shook out in seats. So overall, great news. The far right was kept at bay, we should say, for now, because that does keep them in this main opposition force, because on the other side is this big Popular Front, the Democratic parties, or however they want to call themselves. On the other side, it is very hard now to find a governing majority, because none of the big groups that are not the National Rally got close to the 289 seats that they need for an absolute majority to pass laws, to get a clear governing mandate. And we're just not there, also for a couple reasons. One, the Fifth Republic's institutions are not built for coalition making. Even when there has been cohabitation, and we've talked about cohabitation before, it's been because one party got a majority in the assembly that's just not the same as the president's party. This is completely different. These are parties that are not used to making coalitions. Trust me, as a Belgian, we are very familiar with this. They are not at all. Even for the New Popular Front, I think what the key challenge that they're running into now is that they had an excellent electoral strategy. They have no governing strategy, which is why we're seeing now a lot of bickering around who is going to be the prime minister designate, the person they're going to run by Emmanuel Macron. So it was definitely a gamble. To me, this is not like Macron's grand strategy worked. I really don't think we're there. It wasn't as bad in terms of the far right coming into power, but it shattered a lot of governing capabilities. We're just in complete gridlock.
The way I see it is that the big question is whether Macron had to call these elections. I think this is where a lot of the French analysis is sort of in some ways impacted by people's sort of visceral dislike now of Emmanuel Macron. I mean, he's clearly reached sort of late stages politician, feels sort of Tony Blair-like in the UK. I mean, obviously that was Iraq related, but it just seems like, you know, one of the problems of creating sort of a centrist party is that you don't have that many people that are, you know, complete loyalists to you. But anyway, I think the big question is, was he going to have to call this election? I'm not an expert enough on the inner workings of French legislative processes. It seems like he was going to face a no confidence vote, over the budget that might prompted this vote. And I think if that is the case, then calling it now made sense. And I think what it demonstrates is that, counter mobilization works. That in some ways, by calling this election right after the far right did well, and part of the reason they did well is because it was seen as sort of a free hit on Macron in European parliamentary elections, and that everyone freaked out. The thing is, the freak out was sort of the point, because by people freaking out, they went out and mobilized and thought and acted very tactically. You had tactical voting, both in this election, also in the UK election, which was fairly remarkable, where Labour's vote actually went lower than what was expected, and they got a huge number of seats, in part because people were in various seats, voted against Tories, and even though they might have voted Labour otherwise. But back to France, people acted very tactically. Gabriel Attal pushing for Renaissance candidates to step down if they weren't in first or second place, I think really significant. And the same for the Popular Front. So now the question is, I think, how does France govern itself? How does sort of France return to a two-party system is effectively, I think, what we're talking about here. Because can the center left and the left form a coalition? If they can, that's big enough to win. Or does the National Front spend the next few years trying to continue to move to the center to sort of win back the center right, or to win the center right over? The vote shows that if you have the National Rally on the ballot, they can't get a majority. They can't really get close to a majority. The question is, if the alternative is Mélenchon and the far left, that's, I think, the danger. And then if you go and you have, the second round of voting, presidential election, if Mélenchon got 25% and Le Pen got 30%, and they're the top two candidates, then I think you're in for a situation where the National Rally could actually win. But this is now a big test of the center and center left and center right about how they can form a coalition. And we'll see how it plays out. But better it play out now than just sort of happen, a few years from now, or even 6 months from now, where the National Rally would have been able to sort of, I think, really, bathe in their glory, having done well in the European parliamentary elections.
Your point on Mélenchon is a really good one. Like, it showed in pre-election polls, but also in between the two rounds, how worried some people in the center and center-right were about Jean-Luc Mélenchon. They just see him as a figure that's just as worrying as Marine Le Pen. And now that on the National Rally side, Jordan Bardella, which was leading the election for the National Rally, is increasingly popular. He's a really young guy. He's like 28, something like that. It's it's also really concerning because he can put that kind of face on the party, and that's worked really well. I think if something happens and in 2027 he's the candidate for National Rally, I think we have a very different situation on our hands. Also because when you look at, and that's a nerdy math, but still, when you look at where the votes went between round one and round two, a lot more people who had voted for the left wing in the first round, whose candidate was not available in the second round, it was basically National Rally versus like a center right or right wing. They did that. They moved their vote over to a center right person at higher margins than the right wing did to go to the left. So it's obviously it worked out fine, but to me that's a signal that the next time around that's going to keep eroding. And people in the right wing are going to keep looking for reasons to justify voting for the National Rally, I think. I mean, this time around, we saw really the implosion of the internal structures of Les Républicains. So who knows where that party's going to go in the next few years. But I think it's setting up the board. It worked out that it was held now, I think. But it's setting up the board for a very complicated situation in the next few months for governing, but in the next few years for the political stage as well. Because Macron has not done any work to set up a succession.
No, I think maybe just final thought is that it demonstrates that a centrist party, oftentimes we hear this sort of dream or espoused in the United States about, man, if only we had a no labels party, someone from the center. And we saw that in France. And the problem is that now it's about sort of France picking up the pieces and trying to reestablish the two-party system that Macron effectively blew up when he won in 2017.
Well, that or a change in the system. There have been calls in France for a more proportional system for years, and this might be it.
Yeah. The one other thing that we're tracking is Ursula von der Leyen is going before the European Parliament, hoping to be confirmed for a second term. The sense is that she's almost definitely or probably going to get confirmed, but this is done by secret ballot, which is like totally insane. Why does the European Parliament, when it talks about transparency, allow MPs to just like vote secretly on this really critical vote, probably the most important thing they do? It's totally nuts. And so you can't be sure because she's going to lose some probably people within her own party and some of the other parties that support her. So, and if she goes down, well, it's total chaos. That's something we will be tracking.
That's happening July 18th, Thursday, when we release this, or right after, which is also the day where the new assembly in France is supposed to get seated. So even more political news happening.
A lot happening this week. Also, we should just note the attempted assassination of Donald Trump this weekend. Obviously, incredibly scary moment in American politics. The Republican convention is this week. That is definitely being watched closely in Europe and by all of us. But with that, I think let me turn to the interview that we have with Camille Grant. We are thrilled to welcome Camille Grant to the Eurofile. Camille is a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He leads the organization's work on defense and disruptive technologies and European security. Previously, he worked as Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO from 2016 to 2022, piloting NATO's work in capability delivery, missile defense, and armament and technology cooperation. He has also held senior positions in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs as head for disarmament and multilateral affairs and the Ministry of Defense as Deputy Diplomatic Advisor to the Minister. He is also the author of an outstanding new report at ECFR, Defending Europe with Less America. Camille, welcome to the Eurofile.
Thank you, Max. Great to be here, and thank you for having me.
So, Camille, we have just survived NATO week here in Washington, where there was a lot of focus on American politics. People were sweating a lot. We had an immense heat wave here in Washington. But maybe we could focus first on the NATO summit. And what do you think sort of came out of this NATO summit? It's NATO's 75th birthday. Were there big, remarkable things that really caught your attention?
Altogether, it was a bit of a celebration summit. It's the 75th anniversary. It was the nice family picture. You know, everyone's united. Everyone's supporting Ukraine, maybe with one Orban exception somewhere in back. But altogether, a positive message that the alliance is united, that the alliance is moving forward on defense spending, on the support to Ukraine. Some good announcement when it comes to air defense for Ukraine or long-range fires in Europe. So the vibe is good from the Europeans. Of course, domestic politics, not only in the US, but also in France, we were just after a snap election. In Britain, we just had a new prime minister, is part of the picture, positively or not so positively. But altogether, I think the message is that of an important summit, but more of a celebration summit. If you compare with the Vilnius summit or the Madrid summit, there's not a major NATO document coming out of it. There's no strategic concept. The plans were already agreed. So it's a bit of an implementation summit when it comes to the nitty-gritty. But I think it was a positive summit with all 32 allies. And in a way, it's good to not have a big issue of whether Sweden will join or not, or whether we do agree on Ukraine. So from that perspective, I would grade it as a good summit.
Yeah, essentially, there was not much drama in the summit. The last year at Vilnius, of course, there was the Ukraine membership kerfuffle where that was really put on the table. The White House did, I think, a really effective job, whether you like it or not, in sort of squashing talk of Ukraine membership this time.
It was well prepared, to put it simply, by the NATO team, by the White House, by the allies. They didn't want a summit with massive discontent on the Ukraine membership. The message to Zelensky was you're going to get more, and he did get more in terms of language, in terms of the concept of irreversible path towards membership. I think a very strong political signal. Will it be implemented by any administration? We'll see, but it's going to be, I think it was a very positive one. And the narrative was built before. The contentious issues were a bit ironed, not necessarily put under the carpet, but let's say finding some sort of broad agreement that we could work together and that the United Alliance standing in front of the world for its 75th anniversary.
Let me ask you the sort of American politics Biden question in the sense of, we won't get into what Biden should do with his campaign, but more of, as a European coming over, do you think that cast a shadow on the summit, the fact that American politics seemed to be in somewhat turmoil? Was there a degree of panic on the European side of what may come in November, potential for Trump to win? How did that sort of impact the summit?
Obviously, the outcome of the presidential election is still the big orange elephant in the room. Europeans were worried and are still worried. Nevertheless, I mean, none of them wanted to challenge President Biden, and I think he demonstrated leadership throughout the summit. So that's not as if there was a massive concern coming out of it. I think the Europeans are concerned with U.S. politics, are worried that, things will go sour in the election for a Biden administration that they like to work with. But on the other hand, the politics didn't come in to the summit itself as much as it was the talk of town outside the summit room.
Yeah. I did think, maybe back to the kind of summit deliverables, that the language on China, I thought, was actually ended up being somewhat interesting. Not simply that China was mentioned, but the calling out of China and Chinese support for the Russian defense industry, essentially a decisive enabler of the war, struck me as, I think that was a big get for Washington. We've wanted, I think, Europe to speak out a bit more loudly. How did that strike you? Or was there anything else of note, defense production or anything else that you think was important?
The China language is significant. It did mark a bit of a shift for some Europeans, including Macron, for instance, who had very much hoped to get Xi to take a different path. And that has proven unsuccessful in the last couple of years. So now I think the Europeans recognize that the Chinese are not necessarily playing a positive role in the conflict in Ukraine. And that enabled a much more tougher language on that, which is also a message to the Chinese, which is, guys, you can't have it both ways. You can't say you're a peace-loving nation and de facto enable the Russian war effort. The Chinese picked it up. I think they got the message loud and clear. What they're going to do with it is interesting. Are they going to sort of start thinking twice of the consequences of their behavior, or are they going to double down on the notion that this is a big struggle between the West and the China-Russia axis? So that remains to be seen, I would argue.
Was there anything else that sort of popped out to you, takeaways from the summit?
All those side decisions on deliveries to Ukraine, on additional U.S. long-range fires in Europe, including ground-based missiles. Those are very significant. There was also a decision by a group of Europeans to work on long-range fires and the precision strike capabilities. So those tiny sideshows that are for geeks, obviously, but I think are very significant when you look at it. This is where we're going to see more deliverables. A large portion of the summit was obviously the part that couldn't be really public is how fast are we moving on the implementation of the plans, of the ramping up of European capabilities and all of that. In the declaration and in the statements, you can see a sense of urgency and moving forward. We had a number of ministers and prime ministers, the various side events of the summit, and being very vocal about how much they want to move on defense, which I think was a positive message to Washington to see that the Europeans are actually waking up and more serious on defense. But of course, the details, that's more of the sort of nitty-gritty classified process. But I think that there was good signaling that it's moving forward, even if a lot needs to be done.
The signaling was very positive, but it strikes me, I guess I scratch my head a little bit when it comes to the implementation of the regional plans, because when Denmark is giving away all its artillery, and then I sort of think, well, how can it actually be meeting NATO needs? And if ammunition stockpiles are being given to Ukraine, all of which makes perfect sense. And I'm not saying that, but I guess when you look maybe separate from the summit, how are you sort of assessing the NATO now, 2 years into this war, particularly the effort to support Ukraine? We released a report called Is NATO Ready for War? And the answer was sort of, and it largely is in some ways still dependent on the U.S. kind of being the linchpin. But do you think, is European defense stronger now than it was 2 years ago? Has it been weakened by supporting Ukraine? And then, so this expansion in money is helping in the longer term, but there's some real shortfalls now.
I think we have to be very specific on that, because I don't think it's a sort of general thing. It's more about how yes, the Europeans have given up a large amount of their ammunition stockpile and they are reconstituting. Mm-hmm. So if today you're saying, do we have the right stocks of ammunition? We probably didn't have it before Ukraine, and we less so today. The general direction of travel is to rebuild this, also based on the assumption that any direct threat on NATO won't come before at least a few years. Therefore, there is a bit of a reconstituting time. What I would say is that it's more about specifics. Yes, indeed, donations to Ukraine have created specific gaps when it comes to ammunition, when it comes to air defenses. Typically, the Germans are leading a big effort, and the Europeans do carry a large portion of the donation to Ukraine of Patriots that is supplemented by American donations. But altogether, those things have to be carefully watched because you don't want to create a situation. But on the other hand, I think it's a broad recognition. The Europeans can't say on the one hand that the Ukraine war is existential. On the other hand, say, I'm going to save all of this in case, things go sour in Ukraine.
No, of course.
So from their perspective, what they understood that supporting Ukraine is good for our own security. It's not only good for Ukraine, it's also helping our own security. So that explains that countries like artillery, the Danes, but also the French have been giving up a large portion of their artillery, which were pretty tiny to be honest. Others have been giving up a lot of their air defenses, a lot of their ammo stockpile. So there is an effort to reconstitute all of this that is there. The bottom line is that the Europeans need to do three things at the same time, and that's very demanding, and hence the importance of money. Supporting Ukraine, altogether, manageable, not that huge in terms of money. We're talking about, fraction of defense spending in Europe. Do the right thing in terms of reconstituting stockpiles, rebuilding readiness and all of this, which is demanding, but also start preparing for the future. And none of those, can be delayed. So, and usually you always add this sort of choice of saying, okay, I'm going to invest in the future and I'll take care of the ammunition and the spare parts later, or I'm going to focus on small combat-ready forces to send to Afghanistan, but I don't need to think too much long-term in high-end capabilities. So now that there is this need to do everything, which is very demanding, especially for those allies that had been free-riding for too long and were underspenders for a decade or more, then the step is pretty high. But it's happening. So I think the direction of travel is not that of a weakened European capability, but certainly that of a strengthened European capability. But this effort needs to be sustained in the long term.
Let's talk maybe about your paper and what was not really talked about at the summit, which is the European pillar of NATO. That has become kind of I think an important concept or a key talking point amongst European leaders. We at CSIS have done a lot of work over the last couple years highlighting the need for European defense transformation, really by leveraging European integration. Your paper, Defending Europe with Less America, I think is very much in that vein. It struck me, I guess, my sort of disappointment when I think about this summit. It's a historic summit, NATO at 75. But when I look back at NATO at 50, 25 years ago, when there was also a summit in Washington, that was sort of the moment where I think NATO EU really kind of decoupled, where Washington came in and said, the Saint-Malo Declaration when Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair in December of 1998 were holding hands and agreeing to create a EU rapid reaction force, the U.S. basically saying no, that we don't want the EU to be a defense actor. And there's been real evolution in the Biden administration, I think a softening of its approach and I think embrace of EU defense initiatives. I was hoping we would sort of fully turn the page on that kind of last 25 years, which I don't think have been useful or productive, and really point toward a path of building a European pillar. Well, I'm curious for your thoughts on that general framing, and then we can dive into maybe some of the specifics of your paper.
I mean, first of all, when we talk European pillar, we're not talking about an EU pillar or an EU caucus. I think the EU has a role to enable this European pillar. I'll come back to that, but I think it's really important to frame it in this way. There are European allies that are non-EU allies that are very important, starting with the UK, but you can think of Norway, Turkey are big allies and allies that matter. So altogether, the conversation is not EU versus NATO conversation, even though the EU-NATO relationship needs, and I very strongly agree with that, to be vastly improved to enable this European pillar to go in the right direction. But I think it's very important it's not an either or, type of conversation. It's a conversation where the Europeans need to take much more responsibility for their own security because the U.S. has a big China pacing challenge, because the U.S. has its own resource constraints, and because the U.S. is also domestically polarized. There is a chance that it's going to be more difficult to extract troops and capabilities from America. So altogether, this is where the concept of the European pillar, from my perspective, it was a bit of a missed opportunity to not push it further at this summit, because we had a good summit, and I think it would have been a nice to have addition to this. I think the conversation is, we're a bit in the middle of the river. We moved away from the very traditional 3D conversation of the late 90s of, avoiding duplication, decoupling, and so on. But we're not quite where we should be in terms of let's do this seriously together. It is indeed a bit of a missed opportunity. I don't want to blame it on anyone specific. We can dive into maybe the administration was not forward-leaning enough. Maybe the Europeans didn't do their sales pitch well enough. I think there is a sense among some Europeans that they want to avoid a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, saying, we are trying to put our act together and we need a little less of America in Europe. Some of them are still very convinced, and which is technically true today, that they cannot do without the US. My argument is to say, we need to be organized in thinking through this, which will identify where we cannot do without the U.S. And there are certain domains where the U.S. support is likely to remain critical for the foreseeable future. There are other domains where the Europeans can do much more. And all of this requires a proper conversation.
I think some of those domains, particularly on the nuclear side, and we've seen Europe sort of fast forward to talk about Euro nuclear bomb, and hopefully we won't need to sort of have that conversation. And I think it's an important conversation to have, but it may have become a little too central.
No, I think on the nuclear dimension of that conversation, I think we have to follow a sort of do no harm principle. So nothing should be done that undermines the idea of a U.S. extended deterrent. Yeah. Second, it is a conversation where everyone needs to be thinking of what do we mean. So there it's important to start by saying what it shouldn't be. It's not an EU bomb, won't work, doesn't make any sense. It is not a replacement for the U.S. deterrent, a sort of U.S. extended deterrence minus, and it is not a way for the EU to pay for the French nuclear deterrent. Those things are off the table. And then from there, you start a conversation on saying, okay, what sort of American commitment remains? And I very much hope it remains at least at the same level, number one. Second, can the Brits and the French do things differently to add a level of reassurance in the nuclear domain? Thirdly, when it comes to the non-nuclear allies, what do they bring to the table? Are they going to be more involved in the dual-capable aircraft mission? They've all modernized their aircraft fleet. The B-61 have been modernized. So what does that mean in practice? Those allies that don't fly the nuclear mission, how can they contribute? Is it about conventional deep precision strike capabilities? Is it about supporting the nuclear mission? Is it about investing in missile defense? And I think this is a fair conversation to have in the longer term. But I think the core idea is to say, okay, how do we make deterrence more robust in an environment where Russia is relying heavily on its nuclear capabilities?
Maybe let's turn also to other recommendations that you put forth in the paper that where you're trying to outline how to sort of begin to march down this path toward a European pillar. What else would sort of be needed to begin to form the European pillar of NATO?
Money matters. So a sustained defense investment is critical. It's not only doing a search for the next couple of years to have good numbers for the next NATO summit. It's really about making this effort. And there, I think a lot of Europeans have turned a corner. I would credit the Nordics, of course, the Eastern flank allies for doing a lot. I think Pistorius in Germany is pushing really hard for Germany to turn a corner. But there are still allies that are lagging behind. And those need to put their act together. And all of us in Europe need to sustain this effort, which might take a number of Europeans way above 2%, at least for a certain period of time, to make up for the years where they were underspending. And if we want to do this, it is there. Then you move into the hard stuff. So with the money, you want, to have a plan to support Ukraine in the absence of another US supplemental in the foreseeable future. We better think about it now rather than in a sort of catastrophe mode if it proves difficult to get another supplemental. And that is not only air defenses and ammunition, it's also thinking about spare parts, sustaining the Ukrainian forces and all of that. And sustaining the F-16 fleet that is coming in and the Mirage 2000 and so on in the long term. Second, it's about rebuilding mass and readiness. And this is where the European forces have become too hollow, including very capable allies. You take Denmark, super committed to a number of missions, NATO missions abroad, in Afghanistan and all of that. But the force had become very, very tiny. So there is a need to rebuild a bit of mass there. You take a country like the Netherlands, they used to be able to deploy a corps in the Cold War, and they are having a hard time deploying an armored brigade now. Bulk of the weight is also falling on the bigger allies. So does Germany, France, Italy, the UK, do they have the sort of capabilities to provide some mass in the event of a crisis to reduce the burden on the US for being the contingency force? And then you go to the critical enablers. And this is where the European shortfalls are the most visible. And it's also where the US is the most resource constrained. Many of these critical enablers, they might be required for an Asian contingency. There you want the Europeans, and that's a sort of decade-long endeavor to build up their ability to do GGR lift, air-to-air refueling, missile defense, joint intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, have more drones, have more satellites. This is something where the EU can play a very useful role, in my view. They're committed to spend money, and they can leverage their own toolbox to enable a conversation, joint acquisition and all of that. And I think that can be done and should be done, because this is where we can really reduce dependencies on the US. And therefore, and this is where I very much end up, with a situation where NATO is stronger. It's not about undermining NATO, it's about making NATO stronger by having a more balanced burden where the Europeans carry their weight, develop the ability to do this. And I think that's, in the long term, a bit irrelevant to US domestic politics. It's going to make the US commitment to Europe more sustainable because the Europeans will carry their weight. So all of this is, for me, it's a long-term endeavor, agnostic to the outcome of the US election. And I would much prefer that we do it in an orderly fashion, in an open conversation with the US allies and in an open conversation amongst Europeans.
It does sort of seem like this should be the direction of travel. I think perhaps the fear in Washington is that as much as we complain, I think, about lack of European defense capabilities, we do really like the fact that we sort of call the shots when it comes to Europe militarily, our presence in NATO. And I think we're sort of very attached actually to the status quo. And so is the challenge here in implementing your plan, is it on the European side, or is it actually here on this side of the Atlantic and sort of convincing Washington, the United States, and this isn't just about the Biden administration, this is deeply held, about actually a sort of a degree of transition here might make sense. And so how do we sort of go forward here?
The biggest practical challenge is on Europe. If you want to sustain the effort, invest in the right set of capabilities, that's going to take time and money. But politically, you're right. I think there is a conversation, and I think it's interesting that this conversation is in a way as much of a Washington conversation than it is a Brussels conversation, or Brussels meaning the NATO and EU bubbles. Yeah. Because the US probably needs to, you can't on the one hand say, spend more, be much more responsible, and then, the burden sharing comes with responsibility sharing at some point. And I'm not into, changing, the flags on the top jobs at NATO or whatever. I don't think this is the real issue. But I really think it is important that the Europeans and the Americans have a very honest conversation. And then at the end of the day, it is also important in the US maybe moves away from the notion that it's impossible if we don't lead on everything. Yeah. US leadership, US presence is important and will remain important for European security, but it's not necessarily in the old way. So what I would argue for is a sort of NATO 3.0, which is not the Cold War NATO, which is not the post-Cold War NATO very focused on crisis management, but is a NATO that is more focused on European security, on collective defense, but also probably more European than it has ever been, because for all the reasons we mentioned about the US having potentially other priorities. And bottom line is Europe is becoming theater number 2, which was never the case throughout the Cold War.
And to be fair, I think there has been a real shift in this administration. I'm curious if you agree with this between especially Trump, but also Obama and Bush and how it sort of sees the EU. I guess my criticism is I think they could be more forward leaning. They could say, let's try to do the European pillar and outline it. But at the very least, when the EU comes forward with ammunition proposal, the use of the European Peace Facility, that the expansion of the EU into defense, when the EU has ideas, the administration isn't saying no, at least publicly. You know, during the Trump administration, PESCO, suddenly Mattis and others came out and said, don't do this. I guess, how would you kind of characterize right now the Washington EU NATO triangle?
I think we've turned a corner. I would agree with you. We're a bit halfway to this. I think there is always a dose of skepticism or concern that, you know, it might hurt American business interest in Europe, in the defense sector, or that it might be coupling too much and so on. So I think there is and that probably would be a task for the future administration, because it's not going to happen in a campaign moment, to really think through what this means. Mm-hmm. And that entails, in my view, to really go much deeper into the NATO-EU conversation to try to move that. So I would very much hope that the next Secretary General, Mark Rutte, and von der Leyen, and the new EU team, including Kaja Kallas, are really in sync on this and trying to make it work. Because my experience inside the NATO building and also talking to my EU counterpart was that there is still a degree of suspicion and a degree of competition that prevails. When I would argue that in this day and age, we need to leverage the best of both organizations, make sure that they are as much as possible in sync, recognize that they are not exactly the same organizations, but, you know, to put it in very simple terms, you know, NATO is very good at defining requirements and so on, and that shouldn't be challenged. And if the EU does think it should be marginal to that, to take into account the case of the non-NATO EU member states and so on. But the EU has a lot of tools when it comes to industrial policy, resilience, can enable military mobility.
Potentially financing.
And as deeper pockets, to be honest. Mm-hmm. So you can leverage that. We can have a win-win situation rather than having a sort of competition and suspicion that I wouldn't say prevail all over the board, but are sometimes the default setting in many capitals, including Washington, in the bubbles, the sort of deep state of NATO and the EU. Based in Brussels, it's always striking to have this feeling that they don't know each other. There's good high-level conversation. Jens Stoltenberg had a very good relationship with von der Leyen. But when you go into the weeds, it's much more complicated. And I think this can be fixed. And I think every country should come into this with a more positive effort to fix it rather than just saying, okay, let's blame it on the Turks and the Cypriots and not move.
I think that's a great point to end on. It does strike me also that part of the challenge is the EU has to have resources. If the EU suddenly is active in doing big, tangible things, which it's begun to do, then suddenly it's much easier to cooperate between agencies and organizations.
Indeed, and there the EU has also to be serious on the money. I think one of the problems with the EU is that it often states very high ambitions, and then you end up with couple of billion a year, and you're like, okay, that's 1% of defense spending in Europe. You don't really expect to shape the European situation with 1% of the budget. If they table much more money, and there have been figures floated that are very significant, von der Leyen used a 500 billion figure for the next budget cycle of the European Union. We'll start talking business because that would mean, even if it doesn't end up at this level, or if the figure remains to be refined, when you start talking tens of billions a year that support research and development, that support acquisition, you're in a different ballgame.
Absolutely. Well, Camille Grant, thank you so much for being here. It's a fantastic report, Defending Europe with Less America. I had a great time seeing you over the last week, and hopefully you'll get to some better weather in France soon. So, Camille, thanks so much for joining us on the Eurofile.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm a big fan of the Eurofile.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Please also check out Camille Grand's recent policy brief titled Defending Europe with Less America. It's linked to in the episode description. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time on the Eurofile.